My name is Ghislaine Wood and I'm Acting Director at the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts at the University of East Anglia. Thank you for joining me today. It's a great pleasure to be here talking to Viking guests. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Sainsbury Centre's history and collections, and I'm particularly going to focus on our Arctic or works from Alaska in our collections. So, starting with the Sainsbury Centre. Some of you may have visited it. We are the University of East Anglia's art gallery and we're based on the campus in Norwich. And the Sainsbury Centre really is one of the most remarkable museum buildings built in the second half of the 20th century. It stemmed from Robert and Lisa Sainsbury of the great supermarket fame, giving their collection to the University of East Anglia in 1973. It was a remarkable act of benefaction. They'd been collecting since the late 20s and into the 1930s, and they'd amassed a huge collection of art that spanned over 5,000 years of human creativity. The collection encompasses both European modernism, but also works of art from around the world, including Africa, Oceania, the Americas, and from Japan and the Far East. So it's a remarkable collection of well over 2,000 works given initially. And Robert and Lisa had this vision of keeping their collection together. So they offered it to the University of East Anglia, then a new university, one of the great post-war universities that had been founded in the 60s. And the university allowed them to build their own museum building to house the collection. And I think with great foresight, Robert and Lisa Sainsbury commissioned Norman Foster, the young and pretty much unknown architect Norman Foster, to build them a new museum building, which basically changed the paradigm of museum structures. The Sainsbury Centre was completed in 1978 and is a great example of the high-tech style, the new style that kind of superseded modernism. And it's quite interesting to remember that the Sainsbury Centre opened within 1 year of the Georges Pompidou Centre in Paris, which of course was designed by Norman Foster's great friend Richard Rogers, and Foster and Rogers had worked together prior to both these buildings and had sort of formulated their aesthetic. And the Sainsbury Centre still is strikingly modern. It's an enormous hangar type space, a great building that's over 100 metres long and houses sort of multifunctional spaces within it. So it has an area that's dedicated to the Sainsbury collection, but it also has teaching spaces and leisure spaces, a shop, cafes. And of course it leads out onto the beautiful campus at the University of East Anglia. We're set within 350 acres of parkland with a broad. And one of the new initiatives at the centre that we have been working on recently is the Sculpture Park project, which will see us install 2 to 3 sculptures a year over the next 10 years. And in fact, we have almost 30 sculptures in the park already. So it's a very dynamic and institution, and it still feels quite young. But it's remarkable because we are on the campus and we have, of course, students who work in the building and are lucky enough to appreciate the collections on a daily basis. But it's also dynamic because we have students from many different disciplines across the university who enjoy the Sainsbury Centre collections. So Norman Foster and Robert and Lisa Sainsbury travelled around the world looking at examples of the most modern museum buildings, and they did a huge amount of research and eventually developed this strikingly modern solution, a great steel space frame building with all of the services housed in the skin, which enabled the whole centre of the building to remain open. It has been described as more sort of Boeing than Bauhaus, and it does bear a resemblance perhaps to sort of aeronautic buildings. And of course Norman Foster was very influenced by aeronautic design. But the building lends itself brilliantly to housing the remarkable collection. At the centre of the building we have what's known as the living area, and this is a space that is laid out with Robert and Lisa's collection. The design of this area has remained largely the same since the building opened in 1978, and in fact Norman and Robert and Lisa were responsible for laying out the collection in this way, and they wanted to emulate the Sainsbury's house in London. In London, the Sainsbury's had displayed their collection sort of together. They made no distinction between European and non-Western art and showed all objects with a certain equality. So this was emulated in the Sainsbury Centre, and you'll see what's quite remarkable when you arrive at the centre is that the living area makes no distinction between these different types of works of art and encourages everyone to appreciate the works on display for what they are. A very minimal approach is taken to interpretation. There aren't huge sort of text panels and lots of labels telling you what objects were or were used for. It very much requires of you to sort of contemplate the works and to treat each object in its own right, and that was extremely unique at the time that the building went up in 1978 and remains a very important part of the aesthetic of the Sainsbury Centre. What you're also struck by when you arrive at the Sainsbury Centre is the sheer quality of the works on display. The Sainsburys had a wonderful eye, but they also had great advisors. They had a budget, so every year they only spent a certain amount on works of art, and they really prided themselves on making judgments about what works should join their collection, should enter their collection. And of course they've been proved right over the years. Their support for Francis Bacon when he was a relatively unknown artist really just showed how they judged contemporary art in the most sort of progressive way. They developed a very close relationship with Francis Bacon, and we have over 11 works in the collection by Francis Bacon. So Bacon, of course, is the most highly regarded and highly valued British sort of post-war artist, and his works command the greatest prices at auction. So Robert and Lisa developed this very close relationship with Francis Bacon when he was just starting out, and they supported him. Robert underwrote his overdraft and enabled him to continue working when he wasn't selling much work. But of course Bacon became one of the great giants of the post-war period, and we're really lucky to have these astonishing works in the collection. And that follows through to other relationships that the Sainsburys had with other artists. They were extremely close to Alberto Giacometti, one of the most important sort of Parisian post-war artists. They amassed over 35 drawings and a number of paintings and sculptures by Alberto Giacometti in the collection. So it makes it one of the most significant collections of Alberto Giacometti's work in Britain. So again, they chose the artists that they wanted to support, and they continued to collect them throughout their lives. The other great sort of giant of the post-war period who's represented in the collection is Henry Moore. Henry Moore was a great friend of Robert and Lisa. He was godfather to their son David. And again, the Sainsbury Centre has a significant collection of works by Henry Moore, drawings, sculptures, and other sort of prints. So it was a close relationship, and we're very lucky to have three sort of monumental pieces in the sculpture park by Henry Moore, as well as a great representation of his works across different periods in the living area. The Sainsburys didn't just collect works of European art. They collected works from around the world and from very many different cultures. Robert Sainsbury's sort of tastes were really formed in Paris in the 1930s, where he visited a number of gallerists who showed works of European art alongside what was then known as tribal art, works from Africa, from Oceania, and from different indigenous cultures. So Robert's tastes were really formed in this period of the 1930s, and I think that's really reflected in the Sainsbury Centre's displays. The collection also has great works of classical art as well, works from ancient Egypt and from Rome and from Greece. So it really is a very wide-ranging collection. But the non-Western works of art, the works that we call, the world art collection, are really outstanding examples from around the world. They range from functional objects right through to sort of shamanistic or ritualistic objects. So there's a great range of pieces in that collection. Lisa Sainsbury was also a great collector of studio ceramics. She formed friendships with artists such as Lucy Ree, and the Sainsbury Centre has one of the most outstanding collections of post-war studio ceramics in the country. So they really did have very wide and eclectic tastes. The works from Alaska in the collection sit within this wider group of material that was collected from indigenous cultures in the Americas. But the Alaskan collection really is outstanding in its quality and in its breadth. We have over 80 works in the collection that span over 30,000 years of human habitation in the Arctic. There are works that go right back into the prehistoric, but we also have works that were made in the early 20th century. And the collection enables us to tell this story of how peoples have lived in the Arctic over many, many centuries, living in very close relationship with the animals and with the environment of the Arctic. We lent over 5 works to the recent British Museum exhibition that looked at the Arctic, but also looked at the impact of climate change on the Arctic. So a really fascinating sort of approach to looking at those indigenous cultures and how they have responded to a changing environment over many, many centuries. But our collection enables us to tell this story of how peoples have lived successfully in the Arctic. We think of that environment as being extreme and very unsuitable for sort of human habitation, but actually indigenous peoples have adapted and have lived in that environment over many centuries, and the objects that we have in the collection tell the story of how they've adapted and developed new technologies appropriate for their environment. Of course, it is an environment of extremes. It can be -40 in the winter and then be, over 30 degrees in the summer. So it isn't just a story of sort of ice and snow. It is a story of sort of abundance as well, in the different periods, in the different seasons of the Arctic. And the Alaskan objects in our collection, and most of them are from Alaska, enable us to tell the story. So I'm choosing a sort of group of objects from our collection that really enable us to show how indigenous people have adapted to their environment.
So we're standing here in front of one of the most spectacular objects in the collection. This is a hunting hat or a sun visor from the late 18th and 19th centuries from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And it's the most fantastic example of how indigenous communities developed technologies to deal with their environment. As mentioned, in the summer, the sunshine can be extremely bright in Alaska. So you get reflection off the snow, off the ice, and of course off the water as well. So these sun visors were used by hunters kayaking, and it protected them from the bright sunlight and enabled them to see prey in the distance, whether it was seals or whales or otters, and of course it also slightly disguised them. I do think this is one of the most extraordinary objects because many of these visors have small birds on them. So perhaps at a distance it disguised them as a hunter, and a prey animal might see a bird in the distance as opposed to the hunter. So it's an incredible piece of sort of ergonomic design that helped in the action of hunting. It's also the most beautiful object. It is an extraordinary shape. It's made of wood. It has a pigment decoration, and then it has the ivory decoration on it too, walrus ivory decoration. The small birds, you have whiskers from walruses, walrus whiskers as the decoration at the back, which have beads on them, and of course this sort of symbolic sled form at the back. So it really is a really beautiful object, but an ergonomic object used for hunting. So I'm standing here in front of our case of snow spectacles, or snow goggles as they're known. The centre's lucky to have 3 examples of snow goggles that come from various different communities in Alaska, and actually that span quite a large date range. Snow goggles are another example of how indigenous peoples have adapted to their environment and created new technologies that really respond to the environment. They're made of walrus ivory, and they were used by hunters and people travelling around on the ice. And they operated to also focus hunters' vision by bringing light in through a narrow slit, and this example shows the narrow slit that helped to focus light and vision. So they were immensely sort of practical, and in fact an essential piece of technology for use on the ice. But they were also used in rituals. Several communities had sophisticated burial rituals that involved the inclusion of a number of objects, and examples of snow goggles have been found in burial sites, obviously sort of buried with the dead. So they also had a ritualistic function as well as being a very practical piece of equipment and an essential piece of daily life on the ice. Examples of these snow goggles can often be very highly decorated as well. And if we look at this example from Ipiotak, it is a lovely example because it shows the decorative forms that were applied to these snow goggles. This probably was a ritualistic object rather than one that was worn, but it also evokes the form of owl eyes. Quite a lot of Inuit art was anthropomorphic, in the sense that it evokes other animal forms and makes connections with animals in the landscape. Here we have a sort of an owl form represented in these snow goggles. They also would have been inlaid with small pebble forms, so they were sort of highly decorative and highly prized objects.
I'd like now to look at this wonderful harpoon head. This is a 19th century, what's known as a toggling harpoon head. It's made of walrus ivory, of antler, skin, wood and sinew. And it again is a remarkable survival that tells us about a really key activity for hunters on the ice in Alaska. A toggling harpoon was a very sophisticated weapon that was developed by indigenous Inuit hunters for sea mammal hunting, so for sort of for seals and of course for whales. And it was a sophisticated harpoon that would embed itself very deeply in the animal's skin. So it really assisted with sort of deep penetration into the seal or walrus, as well as another animal that was hunted, or beluga. So once it struck, the animal's sort of movement and throws would disengage the harpoon head and the barbed head would remain in the animal, and then would be attached to a float, a seal skin float that would stop the mammal from diving. So it was a sophisticated weapon and a key piece of hunting technology. This one is charming because it's in the form of a wolf. You can see the legs and the face there. And again, this is sort of symbolic of one of the most sort of successful hunters in the Arctic. The harpoon is taking the form of a successful sort of hunting animal. So again, the sort of symbolism of animals within the daily life of indigenous people was a really key part of their culture.
So I'm standing here with two other examples of tools used by indigenous communities. Both these objects date from the 19th century, and they're made from different types of materials. One is made from walrus ivory, and the other is actually made from mammoth ivory, which I'll come on to. But again, they're both examples of the tremendous adaptation to environment and the development of tools that were appropriate for particular activities. The top piece here is the handle of a scraper, and that would have been used for scraping animal skins and for the preparation of animal skins. This was a tremendously important activity for indigenous communities in the Arctic. They hunted in kayaks that were made of animal skins, and of course most of their clothing, their waterproof clothing that was made from seal guts, prepared and sewn together, was also made using these kind of tools. So this is a scraper. It would have had a stone blade set within it. And of course, this scraper appears to have been used much more in the preparation of caribou, another great animal that indigenous people depended upon in the Arctic. And it's beautifully decorated with caribou figures and hunting figures. It's an ergonomic design. It's been designed so that it can be gripped. Women tended to be involved in the preparation of animal skins, so you can see it's been designed for someone who's right-handed. But what's fascinating also about this object is, as I said, is it's made of mammoth ivory. Of course, mammoth ivory is an Arctic material. Mammoths roamed the Arctic in the Ice Age, and mammoth ivory was excavated from eroded river sites, and as permafrost sort of melts, mammoth ivory was taken from those deposits. So it's a tremendously useful material for indigenous people. Mammoth ivory also has the advantage of being wider, having a wider diameter than walrus ivory, which means that larger objects could be made using mammoth ivory. The object below here is a pick, an ice pick, and again this would have been used for clearing ice around houses, but also clearing ice in lakes, and of course revealing roots of plants and so on. So ice picks were quite an essential tool. This one is beautifully designed in that it has the whole sort of story of whale hunting and preparation told in the decoration, in the engraved decoration. This example is actually made of walrus ivory, but it's also in the form of a whale, a bowhead whale here at the end. So again, this anthropomorphic approach to the design of tools, and of course making this very close relationship between the hunter and the animals that he's hunting. And of course, indigenous communities used as much of the animal as possible. Objects could be made from the skin, the meat would be eaten, oil would be used for heating and lighting, whale oil. So, there was a tremendous sort of, environmental awareness of the materials of animals and their use and their value to communities. So we're down in the storage areas of the Sainsbury Centre because I wanted to look at some objects that aren't on display in the galleries. And I've selected these objects really to tell a different story, not so much focused on the sort of life and activities of indigenous peoples in the Arctic, but really to explore how indigenous peoples were impacted by the arrival of Europeans. And that really picked up pace during the 19th century. It's hard to underestimate the impact of European traders, missionaries, colonisers during the 19th century. It really impacted indigenous communities in many, many different ways. And sort of hastened the changing of the environment for many communities. One of the interesting elements in relation to trading between indigenous communities and Europeans in this period is that by the end of the 19th century, many historic Inuit objects had been either traded to Europeans or they had collected them. So actually what we find is that the sort of trade in historic material and prehistoric material really sort of gets replaced with indigenous communities developing souvenirs and developing objects that were specifically designed for trade with European colonisers and hunters. So we've got a lovely example of an object here that was actually designed as a souvenir. It's actually a souvenir mug, not a form that was used generally by indigenous communities, but it's engraved with this beautiful sort of decoration showing walruses, whales being carried by birds, and hunters and caribou. But it is an object that was definitely designed for the European market, if you will. So it really signals this moment where historic objects have become more difficult to find and trade, and indigenous communities are beginning to develop objects that are designed for the sort of tourist market. Another beautiful object that may have been designed for trade is this basket. This is a basket made of straw. It's got the most stunning sort of decoration on it, ivory decoration of little seals and seal pups on the lid. It really is the most charming object. Although baskets were used by indigenous communities, this was probably made for European consumption. It's missing a leather strap that it had with a lovely handle, but it really is a beautifully constructed object. Baskets were also made of whale baleen, so the sort of whale teeth that sort of filtered plankton out. This one is made of straw, but there are examples from the 20th century made from whale baleen, and this really just shows the sort of ingenuity and creativity of indigenous artists and craftsmen who could craft whale baleen. They would cut it into strips and then make it into this very fine basketry. And it shows this respect for using sort of every part of the animal, that every part of the animal had value and could be used. So there are lovely examples from the 19th and 20th century of whale baleen baskets, but this is one made of straw. But it really is charming with its seal decoration. So I've chosen as the last object to look at in the Sainsbury Centre collections this charming canoe ornament. It's in the form of a sea otter, and it would have been an ornament that was hung on the side of a canoe. It's got two holes in the reverse of it where leather straps would have been tied through so to attach it to a canoe. And of course it's in the form of a sea otter, which was one of the main staples, the main animals hunted by indigenous communities in Alaska and in the Bering Sea. So the sea otter also tells an extraordinary story, I think, of the impact of European hunting and European consumption on indigenous peoples. the market for sea otter, the biggest market for sea otter fur, was in the Far East for clothing, particularly in China and in Japan. And the voracious hunting of sea otters during the 19th century, and in fact going back into the 18th century, really led to this catastrophic fall in the population of sea otters, and that by the end of the 19th century, the sea otter was almost on the point of extinction in Alaska. And it wasn't until the 20th century that protections were put in place. So the sea otter, I think, tells this story of how European sort of consumption of the natural world really led to a catastrophic failure that really impacted indigenous communities in the 19th century. So it's a charming object. It shows the sea otter on its back in its sort of resting and feeding position. It's terribly humorous. It has two holes where there would have been inset eyes. But it shows this sort of, this classic sort of position of the sea otter. Of course, sea otters sleep in rafts in very large numbers, lying on their back, and it is the most charming object. Definitely one of my favourites in the collection. So thank you for joining me here at the Sainsbury Centre. I really hope you've enjoyed hearing a little bit about our history, our collections, and of course our wonderful Arctic objects. I really hope you'll be able to join us here at the Sainsbury Centre soon.